Okay, guys, so today we're going to continue our flip video from the other day. The other day we had talked about how energy flows through an ecosystem, and we're going to still continue to talk about that, but we're also going to focus on how matter cycles. Now, I really want you to think of the words. In fact, I want you to write these words down in your Cornell notes right now: flow and cycle. To flow means it moves in one direction. It does not go back. It's always going to move in a particular direction. Cycling, however, means that it does originally go back to its starting position. So think of the water cycle, the carbon cycle, anything like recycling. It is when something goes back to its original state. So energy flows, meaning it goes one way through an ecosystem, or matter, however, cycles back. So if we look at this picture, we know that all energy starts from the sun, and through photosynthesis, our producers make it. Well, let's pretend that this zebra is eating some grass. When that zebra eats the grass, it is taking the matter into its body. It is breaking that matter down and using it to sustain its own life, to grow, to breathe, to live, so on and so forth. Well, when this zebra dies, all of its matter has to go somewhere too. It doesn't just disappear. So the body will remain until decomposers like bacteria and fungi can break that matter down back into molecules to be released either into the atmosphere, like carbon dioxide or oxygen, to be stored in minerals or nitrogen in the soil, where then new plants will grow, taking that matter in. So matter does cycle through the ecosystem. So question 1, I want you to write this question on the left-hand side, and I promise you I'm going to be checking your Cornell notes tomorrow for it, or Monday. So I want you to write this question on the left-hand side. Name the 3 energy roles of organisms in an ecosystem. How does each type of organism obtain its energy? So go ahead and pause the video right now and copy this question down. Okay, so the answer to this question is the 3 types of organisms, or the 3 roles, are producers, consumers, and decomposers. Producers use energy, normally in the form of sunlight, to make their own food, which are what we call plants. Consumers have to obtain their energy by eating other living organisms, like what we do, and these are all animals, are consumers. And then the last one is a decomposer. Decomposers are not animals, but they are mainly bacteria and fungi, which obtain their energy by breaking down the waste of the remains of dead organisms. Okay, so make sure that you have all 3 of these written in your notes. So pause the video, write it down exactly like you see it, and take your time and write it neatly, because I think you're forgetting that you're going to have to use these notes to study for your test. Okay, question 2. Again, I want you to write this down in the left-hand column. Name and define the 4 types of consumers. So now we know that a consumer is an animal that has to obtain its energy by eating something else, whether another consumer or a producer. So thinking of that animals eat different things, I want you to go ahead and try and list the 4 different types of consumers. So go ahead and pause and do that now. So did you come up with a herbivore, carnivore, omnivore, and scavenger? Herbivores are animals that only eat plants. Deer, mice, some insects, zebras, those are herbivores. A carnivore is an animal that only eats animals. It does not eat plants at all. Like a lion, tiger, dogs, wolves, those are carnivores. And omnivores are like us, where we eat both plants and animals. And then a scavenger, like a buzzard, eats the remains of dead organisms. But keep in mind, a scavenger is still an animal that eats it. So I told you that I love to come up with dumb, stupid ways to remember things. So here's my way to remember it, all right? Herbivore kind of sounds like herbs, so it eats plants. And then omnivore, when I hear the word omnivore, I think, nom, 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 nom. It eats everything. All right? I know you're laughing, but it's dumb, and so therefore you will remember it. Okay, so let's get back on food chains. Make sure you're making a section in your Cornell notes called food chains. This does not go on the left side, it goes on the right. A food chain is a series of events in which one organism eats another and obtains energy. You know the whole reason that we eat is to get energy, and you should now know the whole reason we eat is to actually obtain the compound glucose. So, producers make their own food. You will always start a food chain with a producer. Then you will have what we call a first level consumer or a primary consumer, which are always herbivores. Then a secondary consumer, which are carnivores. A tertiary or third level consumer, which again can be a carnivore or an omnivore. And then last, you always end a food chain with decomposers. So keep in mind when you're talking about food chains, you have to start with a plant or a producer, and you will always end with the decomposer. So the first organism, like I said, is a producer, and then we go through a series of consumers. Now, these arrows in a food chain are always going to represent the flow of energy. Just like we talked earlier, energy flows, and so that's what we use arrows for. So when this mouse eats this flower, the energy is passing onto the mouse. That's what the arrow is trying to show. So we're not saying that this plant ate that mouse, because I don't know about you, but that is one wicked plant if it would do that, okay? So it will always point towards the animal that is obtaining the energy. So sometimes food shows the transfer of energy from a producer to a primary consumer, to a secondary consumer, to a tertiary consumer. So look at this food chain that I have right here. And you can write the words if you don't want to draw a picture. But we know all the energy comes from the sun. It then goes to producers. Now, producer is the first organism. So this is where we truly start our food chain. So you could say grass to grasshopper, which is our primary consumer, to frog, secondary consumer, to hawk, tertiary consumer. So go ahead and write this food chain in your notes. Again, you do not have to draw the picture. You can just write the words. And above it or below it, I want you to write its label. Producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. Pause the video now and go ahead and do that. So consumers can be listed, like we said, as primary, secondary, tertiary, etc., depending on the location in the food chain. So energy flow in a food chain. Most food chains have no more than 4 or 5 links. There can't be too many organisms in a single food chain because the animals at the end of the chain would not get enough energy or food to stay alive. Every time you add a step, the amount of energy that is getting passed on decreased. Only 90% is lost and only 10% passes on. So think about it. If you're eating an animal that eats a lot of other animals, you're probably getting 0.01% of the energy that you could get if you ate a plant. So think about that. When you're eating lunch or you're out to dinner, and I mean let's be technical here. Where are you actually going to get more energy from? A hamburger or a salad? So think about that. So the big idea. The further along in the food chain you go, the less food and energy is available. In other words, organisms along the food chain pass on less energy than the ones closer. So look at this picture. It's really hard to understand, but photosynthesis, they make sugar, they're green, they're the primary producer. This herbivore is getting more energy when he eats this plant than when the snake eats this herbivore. So let's talk about a food web. The difference between a food chain and a food web is a food chain is just a series of organisms obtaining energy. A food web consists of many overlapping food chains in an ecosystem. So make sure you go ahead and write the definition for food web. Organisms may play more than one role in an ecosystem, and it all depends on the food chain that you're talking about. So for example, if I was going to say, the pine borer eats the pine, which gets eaten by the golden crown kinglet, which gets eaten by the hawk. That is a food chain. Or I could sit there and say that the pine goes to the pine border, which goes to the salamander, which goes to the snake. Notice these two were the same in my food chain, but the food chain is different because the flow of energy went through different organisms. Here's another example of a food web. They are meant to be overwhelming, and they can look really crazy. But the thing is just to break it apart and take it a step at a time. Notice that you have your producers. Around here would be like our primary consumers. And then up here, you're kind of getting into your secondary, tertiary, and then scavengers at the top. Okay? And then, of course, your bacteria, which is your decomposer. So let's talk about an energy pyramid. Another way to show the transfer of energy in an ecosystem is with an energy pyramid. And Monday, when you come to class, we're going to make an energy pyramid. They model the decreasing amount of food or energy available in a food chain. So the reason why we choose a pyramid is because it's always bigger at the bottom. And producers are always going to go at the bottom of the pyramid because that is where all the energy starts. They are the ones that make their own food using the sun. And as you go up, notice that it gets smaller because the amount of energy that is transferred on is smaller. So a tertiary consumer is going to have to eat a lot more organisms to obtain the same amount of energy as a primary consumer eating a plant, because the energy decreases with every trophic level. So the most energy is always going to be available at the producer level. Remember that question I asked you? Where do you get more energy, with a salad or a hamburger? The answer is a salad because it is a producer. At each level in the pyramid, less available energy is there than the one below it because the organisms need energy to sustain their own life. And since so much energy is used at each level, the amount of energy in the producer level limits the number of consumers. That is why you do not have near as many lions as you have giraffes in this pyramid, and you don't have as many giraffes as you have producers. The higher you go in the food chain, the less the numbers there are because they require more energy to sustain their life. So let's talk about how much energy is actually moving on. Only about 10% of the energy contained in one food level is transferred to the next level, meaning that when that zebra eats its plants, 90% of the energy that plant has went to its own life processes, and then some of it was given off as heat. So that zebra only gets 10%. Now let's pretend that lion is going to eat that zebra. So now that lion gets 10% of 10%. And then if something was going to come along and eat that lion, it would get 10% of 10% of 10%. So you can see how it can greatly reduce very quickly. So a closer look at an energy pyramid. They show the amount of energy, and as they decrease as you go up a food chain, which is why it gets smaller. It takes a large number of producers to support a very small number of primary consumers. And it takes a large number of primary consumers to support a small number of secondary consumers. That is why the pyramid is the best shape that we could ever use for energy and mass. Here's another one. And another one. This one, notice how it's showing the kilocalorie. That's like energy. That's calories like what we eat. 1,000 to 100 to 10 to 1. 10% transferring every time. All right, so question 3. Write this on the left-hand side. By now, you should be on the back or on your second page of notes because you are writing enough. If you are not, you need to pause this video right now. You need to go back and you need to write some stuff down because I'm telling you, you're not writing enough then. Why are food webs a more realistic way for portraying an ecosystem than a food chain? So go ahead and pause the video and write your answer down. Well, the answer is most producers and consumers are going to be part of many overlapping food chains. Remember the example that I gave before? So it's not just like a deer is always going to eat this one type of grass. They could eat grass, they could eat berries, they could eat flowers. They have many different food chains that they could belong in. Question 4. How does the amount of available energy change from one level of an energy pyramid to the next level? You should so know the answer to this. So pause it and answer. The answer is 90% is used for its own life, so only 10% is available to the next level. So here are some key ideas. This is something that you might want to take a screenshot of. You want to know this. These are things that I'm expecting you to know from this PowerPoint. Go ahead and write them down or take a screenshot if it's easier. Energy always changes forms through living systems. The role of an organism from a producer to consumer to decomposer are very different. Producers are always going to be the start of a food chain in an ecosystem. There are many different types of consumers. Decomposers are always what return the nutrients to the environment. And a food chain is a series of events in which an organism eats another to obtain energy. And the last and final thing is in an energy pyramid, there is less available as each level goes up. Okay? So if you know everything on this page, you are in really good shape on food chains, food webs, and energy pyramids. Okay, so that's the end of our notes. I know it was a little long for what we're used to, but I'm really hoping that y'all are taking the time to write this because I'm going to tell you this is the bulk of what your test is going to be over. All right, y'all have a great weekend. I'll see you Monday.